and he's going to talk about today's Gen Z news consumer. It gives us a map to 2030. So welcome, Jeremy. Here you go.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, and thanks for sticking with us for those of you on the live stream and in person. So, whoops. Hold on one second here. For those not on the live stream, we'll just cut that first bit. So, I'm here to talk about hope, and maybe it's not the kind of hope that you're imagining. I'm not talking about necessarily hope for Gen Z news consumers or even hope for news organizations trying to reach Gen Z news consumers, but I'm trying to talk about Hope, the graduate of a fairly prestigious American university who pays for the New York Times because she feels she has to, but actually doesn't like it. And she doesn't feel smart enough to understand what those stories are, even though she's paying for that content. And you might assume that all we need to do is make Hope feel better about herself so that she is ready for the high quality journalism she is already paying for. But the truth is that's far from the point. The point is not actually that Hope should have to change, but rather that we as news creators have to do our jobs differently to reach a different audience, and that we have to stop assuming that people will always age into our products. It hasn't happened, it isn't happening, and it's not going to happen. And the truth is that we owe Hope something that we are not delivering. We need to understand what it is she wants, what it is she needs, and frankly, what it is she deserves from news and information. And then we have to go and meet our customers and our consumers instead of waiting for them to come to us.
That I already kind of knew that the industry and the way that people consume news wasn't really working for everyone. And I think it's taken a little bit of time for other people to get that same understanding.
So this is Katrina Pham. She is not only a Medill student, but actually part of the team who was working on the project that I'm going to share with you this summer. What we did in partnership with the FT Strategies team and with some local design research partners and funding from the Google News Initiative is we interviewed ethnographically 45 18 to 24-year-old young news consumers around the world. So in Illinois, in California, in Alabama, in Abuja and Lagos, Nigeria, and in Bangalore and Delhi. And we went, in many cases, into these people's homes or into locations that they chose for us, and we asked them to tell us about their interactions with news. Not defined the way that we think of news, not on legacy platforms. We asked them to show us their mobile devices where they consume very much of their information. We asked them to explain their information diet. What do they do every hour of the day? And we asked them to describe for us their ideal news experience. Not the experience that exists now, not the way that they prefer to use information now, but what that should be like rather than it is like. And in a human-centered design process, we didn't focus on what they told us explicitly, but rather what we understood implicitly from their needs. And they told us things like this. So Praise talks about how information just pops up and can actually be informative, and that's gold. That's the best kind of information, not the information that she needs to seek out, but rather the information that finds her. And Janal explained that Instagram and YouTube tell all the things that are needed for news, their news diet, and that it shields them from this disturbing, constant flow of news and information that otherwise they might find if they were looking at other sources. And so what we're talking about are news consumers who have come of age in a time of information plenty, but not necessarily growing up with the legacy news information sources that were the only sources that people 10 and 20 years ago realistically could get. And so we saw 4 key emergent behaviors from this work. One, that over the last 15 years or so, mobile phones went from an afterthought to a second screen kind of simultaneous experience, to a primary experience, to now being, frankly, in most cases, the only experience. And it's not just for these younger news consumers that they are using their mobile devices, is that they're using their mobile devices for everything, for work, for personal productivity, for self-improvement, for entertainment, for information, and they're very comfortable context switching within, and that they are very thoughtful and very conscious of how much and in what ways they're using these devices. Over and over again, we heard about these younger news consumers saying, well, I had to delete this app, or I had to delete that app because I couldn't otherwise behave and act in the way in my life that I wanted to. The second thing is that they just don't assume that traditional news providers are going to bring them news and information. Not the news they want, not in the form they want, not at the time they want. Rather, they trust people that they know or that they feel that they know to be delivering that news and information. Those people might be journalists, but rarely. They're much more likely to be influencers or creators. They're especially likely to be people that they know in real life or have had long-term contact with, friends, family, peers, someone from your church, someone from an activity that you share. They also look at comments and dialogue about news stories radically differently than I think a lot of news creators imagine. For all too many news creators, comments and dialogue around information is either an opportunity to promote more people to click on content or something extraneous that has to be managed so it doesn't get too negative around the stories that are being told. Instead, these younger news consumers are telling us that the way that they understand the content of the story and its relevance to them is through the comments. In some cases, starting with the comments or the social dialogue and discussion on social platforms, on platforms like Reddit, before they ever even encounter the news story. And that in many cases, they hold the people who are having the dialogue about the news and information in higher regard than the people who are providing the news and information in the first place. And they have honed through a lifetime of interacting on digital platforms a very unique and different and in their own way highly sophisticated strategy around search. This does not mean search in the way that Bing and Google might understand it, but rather that they seek out information about any other piece of information that they encounter on a variety of other web-based platforms. Maybe it's go to Wikipedia, maybe it's go to Reddit, maybe it's look at what people are saying on a social platform. But in all cases, they are sorting through their own information overload and doing their own fact-checking by going out and finding their own information to complement what they're hearing and are encountering. And so for us, as we looked at these four emergent behaviors, and as we looked at, frankly, what is an absolute flood of information that they encounter over social, over group chats, via notifications, and from people that they encounter, they have to have different ways of understanding that information. And so one of the first critical modes of consumption that we encountered is a sifting phase. And the sifting phase is all about saying, of all the information that is out there, of everything that we are bombarded by, what needs to get through to me? How do I make sense of what is worth spending my time on? And then they have four follow-on behaviors, four modes of consumption that come from that. So they substantiate, they study, they socialize, and they sense make. Substantiate is almost like fact-checking, except that it doesn't require someone to be part of a fact-checking consortium. It doesn't require someone to have official authority. It means that they can prove or disprove. And these consumers are very conscious of all the misinformation and disinformation that exists in their worlds. So they need to substantiate through these more trusted networks that this information is valid and worth looking at. The second thing they often do is go deep on any given topic. Because they are not traditional news consumers in the sense that they open a newspaper or listen to some sort of broadcast or watch every day, they need to make sense of the stories, but in the context of what's going on around them. So when they encounter a news story, their inclination is often to start by saying, well, what is the background that I need to have about this particular story? And it's not necessarily coming from any particular news provider. Socialization is a really critical part of the process. It is both a way of receiving news and information that then gets filtered through SIFT, but also a way of communicating, giving back to the communities that they are part of, and also establishing credibility within those networks by identifying information that other people need. It's not just that they use socialization to identify news, but that they also give back to other people in their social circles by sharing the news that they find has value. And then finally, a lot of these news consumers are constantly assessing news based on not only its actionability, but also their ability to take some kind of action based on the news. Is there something that I can do? Is there something that I should do? Is there something that I must do?
Newspapers and traditional news is actually stressful because I think we don't usually consider human or the audience emotions or mental status before they get to put something to the public.
And so a fundamental problem that we have is that the news creators, legacy or otherwise, who are supplying the news are often doing so from motivations that are very different than the news consumers and presuming a different style of behavior from the news consumers. And so what we find is that the supply side, the news creators, and the demand side, the news consumers, have a yawning expectation gap between them. That all too often, the news creators are assuming that if news consumers don't come to them and interact with their products in the ways that the news creators imagine the news consumers should, then it's a matter of training. And we have spent all too long attempting things like media literacy, not so much because we want the media consumers to be literate, but rather because we want to teach them a way of engaging with our products that is desired. And at the same time, all too often, the news consumers are growing jaded or giving up on the news creators because the way that they want to encounter news and information is not being met. This is not to say that all news creators are failing. There are many news creators who are meeting news consumers where they are, who are using language that is appropriate to the people consuming the news and information, who are willing to think about where they should be or in what format they should supply, but it is not enough, and it is not helping to close the gap. That if anything, this expectation gap seems to be widening. And so what we try to do is define what the ideal news experience looks like, a sort of framework to help us close this expectation gap. And there are three major components: being a trusted source, supplying personal significance, and serving news in the desired storytelling format. So when we talk about what does it mean to be a trusted source, there are these three key components: credibility, affinity, and transparency. Credibility is about how you, as a news creator, are empowered and entitled to tell these stories. Affinity are about the connections that you make between the creators and the consumers. And transparency is about how honest and forthright you can be, not just about the storytelling, but your overall motivations for creating stories in the first place. So for example, Faith, who's 24 and in Lagos, talks about how important lived experience is compared to reporting on experience. It's not that our news creators never tell people why they are doing their news creation or how they connect to it, but it's all too frequent and it's often after the fact. So many legacy news creators have given to at the end of a story saying, here are all the reasons that this journalist is credible to report on this topic. But it comes at the end. We know from all of the first-party data that we have that all too many people don't make it to the bottom, and that even when they do, the judgments may have already been rendered about whether this information is relevant or not before you even get to how the journalist is credible, an expert. And so what we find in terms of credibility is that news producers often start with our brand is credible, therefore you should trust us. We have been doing this for 140 years. We have all this expertise. We have this many professional reporters and editors, instead of focusing on what their lived experiences are that might be relevant. And what consumers are looking for instead is a way to build these connections, to understand from the very beginning why reporters are covering a particular topic. When we talk about affinity, it really speaks to the idea that the someone is more important than an institution. That having a connection to the news creator is really crucial to these younger news consumers. Marquise Brownlee, who is a technology creator primarily publishing, not exclusively, on YouTube, one of the people we interviewed said, well, I started following Marquise Brownlee when he had 7,000 followers, and today he has millions. And it was a way of saying, I can recognize high-quality news creators because you've seen the growth that we see in this person's audience. And so again, the news producers here are underestimating the importance of building these relationships directly to consumers. And they're overestimating the importance of having a deep tenure in covering any given topic. It's not to say that years of covering a particular subject don't matter, but they don't necessarily matter as much as the connection established over that period of time. Just doing something for a long time doesn't prove valuable in the way that doing it and building a relationship does. And when we talk about transparency, some of the transparency comes from the very place of the media literacy issues that we've created for ourselves, which is to say, when we tell young consumers over and over and over again that much of the information that they encounter is either disinformation or misinformation or propaganda, that they begin to believe us. And that therefore they don't trust the things they see, and therefore they feel like they need to have agency in the process of proving what is and is not true. It is tempting from the perspective of news creators to say, well, we told you, therefore it is true. But these news consumers have grown up saying, we need to fact check it. Not we need to rely on your fact check, we need to fact check it. And so we see this problem where news producers are all too inclined to use emotion to drive engagement. I'm not just talking about clickbaity headlines, but perhaps overweighting the importance of any given news event as a way to make sure that you click on one more story. And that the trust labels that we've invested so much time and effort into, saying something is news, saying something is analysis, saying something is opinion, not only doesn't really carry the definition that we imagine, but it doesn't resonate with an audience already inclined to be skeptical. And that these consumers are much more credible and savvy about our own business models than we give them credit for, meaning that they know that we need to sell advertising or subscriptions or drive donations and presume that we are therefore driving them to try to get one more click. And that when we think about personal significance, it comes down to two important things. One, is the topic relevant to me? And two, can I do something about it? These young news consumers are very much more engaged in personal responsibility than maybe we have seen in the past. So, when we talk about the topics, a lot of the young news consumers we talk to described a shift. When I learned in school that I needed to be more actively engaged, then I switched my behavior. When I went to the job market, I switched my behavior. These are things that in the consumer goods space, marketers have known for a very long time. When you make these major life stage transitions, is a great time to be reached. But at the same time, news consumers and creators, news creators rather, are not acknowledging that, sort of treating their audiences as if they're monolithic and over-indexing on hard news and gatekeeping. We know what news is, therefore you should take what we say, and frankly ignoring these major life stage changes. So they're not effectively plugging into when are you most open to receive news and information. And with actionability, all too many news creators describe to us a sense that there is so much news that is so dependent on other news stories that I haven't read that I can't possibly keep up. And that this inability to follow these ongoing news threads gives them a reason to opt out. And so we need to do a better job of we need to give them a better job of contextualizing one piece of news relative to others so that they don't have to do extra work. And here is a place where news producers need to be really, really careful about how much news we create and how urgent we imply it is. That overusing alerts, calling everything breaking news, really creates a sense that nothing could possibly be as important as news creators are saying it is. And then finally, that storytelling formats have changed pretty radically, and the needs of these audiences have changed with it. That consumers are beginning to say, come bring the news to me, and I'll take whatever's ever there on the platform that I'm on already, rather than saying, I will change my behavior to come to your news. And so what we see is that news producers often rely on these default stories. One size will fit all. We know that's not true. That we create way too many barriers, paywalls, reg walls, pop-ups that get in between news consumers and the news when they do come to us, and that the stories feel all too impersonal. There's not a reason that this story resonates with me. And that the language itself can be a problem. That now so many traditional news creators depend on journalism schools and highly educated journalists that we create stories that don't resonate for everyone because sometimes they're just too difficult. Linguistically, they're too complicated. And so news producers who are using these complex vocabularies in a sort of didactic style, I'm going to tell you what you need to know, result in what feels like a hopeless tone. Not only do I not understand why this climate change story is what the climate change story is telling me, but also it feels totally hopeless. So I might as well just opt out. And then in terms of the format, we have known this for a long time, that some formats require much more effort from news consumers than others. And sometimes our audiences just want to relax and just want to consume content in a way that is easier. It might be audio, it might be video, it might be animated content, it could be shorter text, but very rarely is it the 5,000, 7,000 magazine-style stories that all too many news creators dreamed of in journalism school. And so what we need news producers to do is to prioritize, or they are all too often prioritizing a single format and downplaying these emerging ones. That in a newsroom of 1,000 journalists, there are a handful, 5, 10, 15, who are focused on new formats. And that in small newsrooms, most of the content created is really focused on serving our older, more core readers instead of ways that work for younger ones. And so how can we close this gap? Well, there are 6 things that we can do. One is we need to consciously be building affinity with young audiences. 2, we need to think about what it means to do better personalization and customization. We are closer and closer because of artificial intelligence, because of better content management systems, to being able to serve audiences and meet them where they are. But we need to think about what that means and how we can avoid oversimplifying what we're doing or talking down to our audience, but rather giving them what they need. Many of these Gen Z consumers are very conscious of algorithms. They talk about even things like, I am not going to linger on this YouTube video because I don't want more like it to be recommended to me, even if I might want to watch this one. And we need to try more and more to develop a direct relationship with the audience members through social platforms and social content. We need to figure out, why is it that news consumers are on social platforms, but news creators can't find a business model that works when they meet them there? And we need to acknowledge that it's great when organizations like the Wall Street Journal define terms like Riz for their audiences, but that's far cry from using the language of the people that we're trying to reach. Maybe our reliance on style guides and style manuals that lock us down to a very specific vocabulary isn't actually working for our audiences. And that all too often they are looking for us to try new formats, to try new ways of doing storytelling, and to, by default, rely just on broadcast style video or legacy newspaper style text is a mistake. And that in trying to modernize formats, we also have to realize that different people have different modes of consumption. And those different modes of consumption are not monolithic. There might be times within their day that younger news consumers are looking for video or looking for audio or looking for short form text, and that we need to be prepared to meet them not just where they are, but in the moment, in the style that they need. And that finally, when we have news stories day after day after day about topics that seem utterly hopeless and don't give our audience any reason or any ability to take action, we do them a disservice. And so, in closing, it is not that younger news consumers don't want news. In many ways, they are more conscious than I think almost any other generation about how important news is and what role that it plays or should play in their lives. They often think about it the way you might think about exercise or diet. But it doesn't mean that automatically they will be served by news. We need to change how we work as news creators so that we can better fulfill their needs. And we have to realize, as we have time and time again with new technologies, that the behaviors we see from young consumers today are not isolated, but rather are near to becoming the norm for a much larger group of creators, of consumers, as tastes and behaviors change over time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. This was really thought-provoking and actionable. What I was really interested in, all of it was interesting, but one thing that struck me was how young people are doing their own fact-checking. But in a lot of news circles, I think especially at the height of COVID, the dirtiest phrase ever was "do your own research." That is synonymous with like the crazy uncle at Thanksgiving who doesn't want to get vaccinated. You know what I mean? But what I love about your presentation here is you're acknowledging that it's not just the crazy uncle who's doing their own research. It's actually mainstream young people who feel like they need to cut through information overload. I'm interested in your thoughts on, by closing the gap using some of those recommendations you left with us at the end, do you feel like the outcome is that they will be doing less of doing their own fact-checking and maybe spending more time with traditional media? Or is that a behavior that's ingrained and we just need to acknowledge at this point?
Well, I think the behavior around fact-checking in particular is not automatically that they don't want to engage with fact-checking from traditional news sources, but rather that traditional news sources don't do a great job of leading people to resources that could make it easier. So if you were to be more transparent and to better enable fact-checking, maybe it means here are some of the resources that I used to create this story, and you can go directly and look at them. Maybe it's here are communities that are having conversations that are reputable about this particular topic, and that not that I am replacing your ability to go and learn from others, but I'm giving you some advice about who and where to learn from. I think all too often we do link to other information, but it's usually other news stories, often from our own institutions, occasionally from other institutions, sort of grudgingly. We have to say this other news organization beat us to it. But rarely do we say, we quote an expert from the CDC. Sometimes we link to the CDC. When we do, it's rarely the database that we looked at. We could start with some of those things. We could say, here is a place where there are non-journalists who are experts who are having a conversation about this topic. And in that way, I think maybe we can better connect people with resources and seem more trustable. We've often talked about things like nutrition labels. Where did the ingredients of this news story come from? That might be one way that would help.
This is more of a comment than a question, but I think you'll enjoy it. In my family chat, one of my siblings shared this just the other day when the Israeli-Palestinian news started. Something I struggle with when reading or hearing the news are descriptions of timelines because they're trying too hard to make it sound interesting. Let's see here. For example, if I were to explain how to make coffee the way the news does, here's an extreme way it would sound. The size of the mug and the strength of the coffee's taste depends on the amount of coffee brewed, a proportion determined before the coffee grounds are cleaned from the filter from yesterday's brew. Then she says her name. A geologist with decades of early morning brewing experience before becoming a nonprofit mediation firm director, describes coffee brewing as an accessible ritual. And she goes on and on and on, and then basically says, unfortunately, when it's written this way, I struggle to understand the news at all. In all seriousness, it's a problem because I'm pretty smart. I think you're onto something with this.
It absolutely resonates, and this sort of, so many things are contained in there. One, trying to make something seem urgent that isn't. Two, trying to make someone, because of their credentials alone, seem authoritative, even on a subject that they have no expertise about. And three, using so many words to say the thing, which is dump out the grounds, put the new coffee in. You know, can we meet the audience where they are? It would make a huge difference, or I believe it would.
Hi. I was just thinking that a lot of the things that you were talking about reminded me of the Daily Skim, which you're probably very familiar with. And, you know, all of the news that they give is like what's current, and it's like just a little bite-sized piece of what's going on and why does it matter. And it's just something that you can just easily read. Do you feel like that's kind of a model that some of these other news organizations should be following, or kind of a trend that might continue more so?
A thing that we've heard for a long time, frankly, since, well, at least a decade online, is that the temptation to just do more and more and more is overwhelming. It's always been overwhelming, and we've never really acknowledged that there is a better way. And the Skim is a really good example, I think, of giving people a finite amount of information, and then they can consume it or disregard it, and they're done. And a lot of news consumers that we talk to describe that as a real challenge. So I'm going to set a particular period of time where I'm going to engage with news, because otherwise I could spend my whole day looking at things and never feel caught up. And so a variety of different sources, all of which had that as a commonality, like this is all we're going to tell you. You may not consume all of it, but at least you feel done. I'm thinking about especially the Skim in email newsletter form. You know, that makes a huge difference. I also think we learned a almost Pavlovian trick, which is if we send out a news alert, people will click on a story, but we have not acknowledged that the people who don't click on it are more likely to stop clicking on any of our stories if we send too many alerts, if we send too many notifications, if every time you look at our video it says breaking. And I think that's the other side of it, is that there aren't enough sources on enough topics who say, this is all you need. And when you think about video platforms like YouTube, like Snap, like TikTok, news creators are more likely to have a predefined cadence. I'm going to do 1 video a week, 2 videos a week, a video per day. And then that's kind of all you need to tune in for. And I think a lot of other news organizations have sort of said, well, if I want to fill the top of my funnel and therefore show more people advertising and get more people to subscribe, I just need more content. And I think more content does not seem to be the answer.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.